Hello there, Mediocre Painter here. I've been painting miniatures for some 30 odd years, and I'm doing YouTube videos to get you into the wargaming hobby, because I've made the mistakes so you don't have to. Today I'm going to talk about Spiteclaw Swarm, and first things first, when you get Spiteclaw Swarm, you're going to have to assemble these chaps. These are push-to-fit miniatures like all the Shadespire miniatures are, and how well do they actually assemble from a push-fit perspective? Do you actually need to use a bit of glue, or do you actually need to use some green stuff in order to fill in gaps? That kind of thing. These are actually a pretty good set as far as push-fit goes. They're a light brown plastic, which you can see on the back here. It means they're a little softer, so they push fit together a little better. But there are a couple of the lesser ones, the sort of festering Scavenger and the other two sort of lesser Scavenger, that don't push fit together super perfectly and do need a little, glue and a little bit more persuasion than usual to sort of push fit together. If you want some tips on push fitting minis together, then you can watch my video here. But generally speaking, these are pretty good. Out of 5, I'd probably give them 3.5 out of 5, maybe even a 4 out of 5 in terms of their push fit nature. And I'm just going to describe, how I went about painting this particular warband, and how I started, what I used, that kind of thing, just to give you some tips or some ideas about how you might go about it yourself. So this is a Scavenger warband, and there's 5 members in this particular warband. We have Squitch, Spiteclaw, we have Kirk, the almost trusted, we have a lurking Scavenger, he's the Scavenger with the 2 sort of Wolverine-esque hand blades. We have a hungering Scavenger who has a mace, and we have a festering Scavenger who has a series of daggers, including one held by his tail. So when I actually started to paint this, I didn't actually look at what the miniatures were called and things like that. I just basically picked up one and just started painting with it. And the one I started with was Kirk, the almost trusted. So if I take a good look at this, I basically was trying to look for a brown, really, for my Scavenger in general. There's a tendency these days to do man rats a bit almost like human flesh, as though they're almost more human than they are rat. And for me, that just never really sits right. So I basically decided, no, I really want my Scavenger to be more ratty than they are man. That's a fairly important decision to make at the beginning. So in terms of the main tones going on here on Kirk, I used actually a leather colour first as his skin, and then I used a P3 brown wash to wash that. And what I found when I did that was it became, surprisingly, very brown, and I realised that wasn't maybe quite what I was looking for. So I then highlighted back up actually with a flesh, and then did a thin wash with the brown. And I found that really worked and gave me kind of what I was looking for, which is brown, but with a little bit of depth to it that makes it look a little bit more like it is really a walking rat. So that's how I did the main parts of this model, really, which are basically his flesh. In terms of the cloak, I suppose, or material that he's wearing, I did kind of a classic sort of, okay, it's a black cloak, and so basically I went, okay, black wash, and then highlighted in a grey. And that's basically how I did that, and quite pleased with the way that actually turned out. In terms of his pokey stick, I suppose, for want of a better description of it, the shaft I did basically in a bestial brown, and then just highlighted with a brown with a little bit of black wash in there. In terms of the wrapping around the metal part of the pokey stick, as it were, I used basically a flesh tone followed by an agrax, and then on the actual sword itself, I wanted it to be kind of like not really looking the best as it should be with Scav and stuff, because they've kind of pieced it together from bits that they've found. So I used a darker silver like a bolt gun or a lead belcher rather than a lighter silver, and then basically I did a highlight with an I wash with an agrax with a little bit of black and a little bit of darker brown in it, and then just picked a little bit out in certain spots with a lighter silver colour like a mithril, just a little bit here and there on it, just to basically give it the look of, you know, a really sort of weapon that they picked up. So we look at some of the finer details here. This chap actually has two little rats on his shoulder, and they're really cool. So basically I did those in a straightforward bestial brown with a brown mixed with a black wash just to make it a little darker. Picked out the eyes with a little red and the teeth where I could with a little white. I then highlighted those with a little of the flesh like I used before, and then just toned it back with a little brown wash just to basically take it back a bit, and I'm really pleased with the way that kind of turned out. It did kind of work. In terms of their tails and his tail himself, I mixed the pink. I didn't actually have a decent pink to use really. I found that like Rin's flesh from P3 wasn't quite red enough, so basically I did the pink the classic way, which is basically take a red with a bit of white and get it kind of the tone that you wanted. Painted those, then just use an agrax basically wash, and I didn't do any highlighting on the tail at all. In terms of his body armor, basically I picked out his back scale armor and his head in a gold, and then I washed it with a brown wash, a thin down brown wash, just to tone it right back, and that really worked out actually. Kind of looks kind of tarnished, and kind of looks like the metal armor that centurions and the like in the Roman Empire kind of used to use, and that was kind of like the colour I was looking for. In terms of his faceplate, basically I used I used a bolt gun metal with a black wash on it, thinned down with a little bit of brown, and I picked out the things over his eyes in the gold again and used the same kind of wash technique as I'd used before on the plate on his back. I picked out his nose in a pink. It seemed to me like that was a good way to really highlight on his face. So I picked out his nose in a pink, and his teeth I actually did in a white, and then kind of did a little flesh wash with actually a thin down flesh paint at the tops of his teeth, where they actually go into the mouth, and that's basically how I did him. In terms of the base, I just used I think here I just used a simple grey with a black wash, and then I didn't quite do a dry brush on it. I sort of used a somewhat wet brush with white on it and just dragged it over a bit. And actually I changed that technique for the other bases that I did in this swarm, because this ended up being a little bit too shiny with that black wash. I mean, it looks just fine, but it wasn't quite what I was after. But it'll certainly do for the tabletop. The next one I did was actually I decided to tackle Scritch Spiteclaw himself. And this model is super cool. I think it's really one of the best models I've seen in the Shadespire series. I really enjoyed painting this particular guy, and I wanted him to be kind of different to the rest in the swarm. I wanted him, to stand out. So I decided I'd do him as an albino, somewhat similar to, old Tranquil. So this guy, basically, I used a white as his flesh, and then I used a grey wash in order to actually pick out everything, and then picked out the highlighting again with the white. That worked out quite well. I was really pleased with the way that kind of worked out. In terms of the actual armour that he has, again, I used that same kind of technique as I did before on Kirk. In terms of I did a gold and then basically a brownie wash to tone it back, and I'm really pleased with the way that kind of worked. In terms of the metal that I picked out here, the silver chainmail and the like, I did that in the classic way, which is I painted it in a dark silver like a bolt gun. I washed it with the black, and then I highlighted it up with a mithril. That is a classic way of doing chainmail. A lot of people actually will do a black and then highlight with the silver with a dry brush. Kind of difficult to do that technique on this particular model because it's quite intricate in terms of the spots where it is. So I found using that technique wasn't really going to work for me. In terms of his sort of undergarments, shall we say, I did those undergarments in a flesh with a brown wash mixed with some sepia, and then basically picked out the highlights with a little white and the flesh mixed together. In terms of his cloak, I did that in a Vallejo Vermilion and washed it with a sepia, and I also picked out the stitching using a flesh tone, and that was also washed in the sepia as well. In terms of his tail, same deal as before. Don't really have a good pink, so I'll mix the pink and then use the Agrax. And what I did that was kind of interesting here is that I didn't have a copper, and I really wanted his spike on his head and his mask to be a copper, and I didn't have one. So I used a gold with a brown wash, and that actually came out quite coppery, and I was quite pleased with the way that kind of turned out. That was pretty good. In terms of his weapon, again, a bestial brown for the wood and the flesh for the wrappings with an Agrax. I picked out the little pieces of metal at the top and the bottom again in a gold, and then with a wash. And since he seems to actually have a proper weapon here, I decided not to dirty up so much his actual weapon, so I actually used a mix of a mithril and a chainmail to give it like a brighter tone to begin with, washed it with an Agrax, and then picked it up with a mithril highlight, so it looked a bit more fancy rather than something that was thrown together by him. In terms of the face here, just did straightforward red eye and teeth the same as I'd done before, basically a white with like a sort of a watered down fleshy paint wash. The base is really cool on this, so I basically did a straight grey with an Agrax wash, and then did a two-stage highlight in the same grey with a little white added to it as a second stage. In terms of the rats that are swimming away, a lot of people do it as though they're like swimming in ooze and do it like a bright green. I decided to do it more as though it were actual real water, so basically I painted it a really beautiful azurite blue that P3 do, and arcane blue, I think it's called, with a blue wash. And then I painted the rats, again the same as I did before, with a bestial and a dark wash, basically black with a little bit of brown, highlighted back up with the flesh, toned it back down with a brown, and picked out the tails with the pink. So that's how I did him. Quite pleased with him. I think of all the miniatures in this warband, he was extremely pleasing to paint. I really enjoyed painting him, maybe because I did quite a good job as well, and I was quite pleased with myself. You then have like 3 sort of lurking lesser scavens, shall we say. And the way this kind of warband works is that Scritch can bring these guys back because he just brings up more underlings from the Underdark. So we move on to the lurking scaven. This is the guy with the Wolverine type blades. And really here, same sort of deal as I've done everywhere else. There's not an awful lot new on him. Except I decided to, on the face on this guy, to basically make it stand out a little more. I basically painted it a flesh kind of colour and then washed it rather than it being a brown like the others. And that kind of worked quite well because it kind of brings to the attention the face a bit more. I guess the significant thing that's kind of different on this guy over the others is our cute little rat in the actual base. And I did this base similarly to the way that I did Spiteclaw's base, except I wasn't so patient in terms of layering it up. I just basically did a grey and an agrax mixed with a little touch of black just to darken it up a bit, and then highlighted with a white dry brush. But in terms of the little rat poking his head out of the base, I did a bilious green around him so he looked like he was coming out of some ooze, and I didn't do anything more than that. I think that maybe I had a little highlight and things like that. And I was fairly rough with it, so you can, if you look at it closely, you'll see there's kind of like some of the ooze is like coming out onto the actual base as well, just to give it a little bit of a glow almost. Moving on to the next guy, which is the Hungering Scaven. Same sort of deal really here, as I've done before, not anything significantly new. This one was a little tricky in the base because the base has like a grid on it with a couple of rats, so that took a little bit of dexterity to paint that one, but again painted the rats in the same way I did before, with basically a basic brown with then a brown mixed with a little black wash, highlight up with a little flesh, and then back down, tone it back down with a little brown. So it's a little bit fiddly to apply that technique to here, but I did apply it and it actually turned out quite well. I'm quite pleased with how that kind of turned out. Here basically he's got stitched together rags. Decided to stick with an older technique on him, which is basically use a grey with a wash and then just picked out the stitching with a flesh. I didn't decide to do any more highlights than that. I kind of kept it very, very flat on this guy, since these guys are really, for want of a better word, cannon fodder. The last guy, who is a really seriously cool model and kind of looks like an assassin, I thought I'd add a little bit of colour to him. So I decided to do his clothes in a vermilion. I then used a sepia wash, same way I did Spiteclaw's cloak, and then picked out the stitching with a flesh. He's got a few boils here and there, so I decided to pick out those boils in a little bit of bilious green and then wash it back with the agrax with everything else, and that turned out quite well. Again, I followed that same thing that I'd done on the other lesser rats, where basically I used like a flesh on the mouthy parts where there isn't any fur, and then washed that down with an agrax, and then picked out the eye with a red. Quite pleased with the way this guy turned out. I think he was the last one I did, and I was kind of into my groove by that point. He took almost no time at all, to paint, because I kind of had sussed it all out in my head what I wanted him to look like. I quite like the red on him. As I say, I didn't check at the time that this guy was a lesser character. I just liked the model cool. I probably would have done him a bit more in keeping with the others and done a black clothing on him, so it actually looked as though he was a bit more in keeping with the others. But still, it works. I'm quite pleased with the way they all turned out. This is a nice warband. I look forward to actually playing them. Hope you found that interesting. If you did like it, please subscribe. I will be doing more. Thanks for your time. Bye.